The soft hum of whispered conversations floated through Greenwood Memorial Park as mourners gathered to bid farewell to Edward Harrison, a man admired for his kindness and charitable deeds. The polished headstone gleamed in the sunlight, inscribed with the words, "A life of service and sacrifice." Among the attendees, a sea of familiar faces offered comforting nods and shared memories. Yet standing at the edge of the crowd was a figure who drew quiet attention, a petite, elderly woman named Mabel Turner. Her deep emerald dress swayed gently in the breeze, and a modest hat framed her silver hair. Clutching a single red rose, her eyes carried a weight of emotion unmatched by the others. As the pastor concluded his final prayer, Mabel took a deep breath, stepping forward with purpose. The murmurs stilled, replaced by an almost tangible tension. "I need to tell you who Edward Harrison really was," she began. The air at Greenwood Memorial Park carried a solemn stillness, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves swaying in the crisp afternoon breeze. Rows of mourners, dressed in somber shades of black and grey, stood gathered around a freshly dug grave, their faces etched with grief and quiet reverence. The polished mahogany casket, adorned with a delicate spray of white lilies, rested beside a gleaming headstone that read, "Edward Harrison, a life of service and sacrifice." Edward Harrison was a name synonymous with compassion. Known throughout the community as a man of action, his contributions to local charities and tireless work to uplift the less fortunate had earned him both respect and admiration. A dedicated philanthropist, he was remembered by many as the man who never turned away someone in need. His absence was palpable, leaving an unspoken void that hung heavy in the air. Among the sea of familiar faces stood Mabel Turner, an elderly woman whose presence, though understated, commanded quiet attention. She wore a modest green dress, its simplicity contrasting sharply with the polished appearances of the other mourners. Her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath a small, unadorned hat, and in her hand she clutched a single red rose, its deep crimson hue stark against her weathered fingers. While others whispered condolences or shared fleeting smiles, Mabel remained still, her eyes fixed on the casket. There was a depth in her gaze, a story untold, that seemed to set her apart from the rest. She stood at the edge of the gathering, unnoticed by many, yet her presence carried an undeniable weight, as if she held a secret too profound to ignore. As the pastor's voice rose in prayer, the crowd bowed their heads, a unified act of respect. Mabel's hands tightened around the rose, her body poised with an unspoken resolve. The prayer ended, and silence fell once more, save for the distant song of a mourning dove. Then, with deliberate steps, Mabel began to move toward the casket. The crunch of gravel beneath her feet turned every head, her purposeful stride drawing the crowd's focus. Whatever story she carried, it was clear that Edward Harrison was more than just a name to her. The air grew heavier as Mabel Turner stepped forward, each deliberate step sending ripples of curiosity through the crowd. Conversations faded, and all eyes turned to the modest woman who now stood at the forefront, her presence commanding attention without effort. She paused by the casket, her hand trembling slightly as she placed the single red rose on its polished surface. Then, with her chin held high, she turned to face the crowd. "My name is Mabel Turner," she began, her voice steady and clear despite the palpable tension. "I know many of you don't recognize me, but I knew Edward Harrison better than most, perhaps better than anyone here." The murmurs began immediately. Faces exchanged puzzled glances, brows furrowed in confusion. Edward Harrison had been a man of the people, widely known and beloved, yet here stood a woman, seemingly a stranger to all, claiming an intimate connection to the man they had come to honor. Ignoring the whispers, Mabel continued, her tone unwavering. You've come here today to honor a man you believed you knew, a man who gave so much to this community, whose kindness and generosity touched many lives. But the Edward Harrison you knew was only part of the story. Before this day is over, I hope to show you the man behind the accolades, the man few of you truly understood. A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of her words settling like a thick fog. Suspicion flickered in some eyes, while others leaned in, captivated by her calm authority. Who was this woman, and what secrets did she hold? Mabel's gaze swept over the sea of faces, her expression a mixture of resolve and sorrow. I met Edward almost 50 years ago, she said, her voice softening with the weight of memory. Not in this town, and not in the life you all know so well. I met him in Birmingham, Alabama, during a time when the world was not kind to people like me. The crowd shifted, a mix of curiosity and unease passing through the group. Birmingham. The name carried its own history, one of struggle and resistance. Edward wasn't just a philanthropist, Mabel continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. He was a man of conviction, a man willing to risk everything for what he believed in. That's the Edward I knew, the Edward who stood beside me in the fight for justice, even when it cost him everything. Gasps rippled through the group as her words painted a picture far removed from the polished image of Edward Harrison they had cherished. Mabel paused, letting the gravity of her statement sink in. She could see the confusion, the skepticism, and the quiet disbelief etched on their faces. But she wasn't finished. I tell you this not to diminish the Edward you knew, Mabel said, her voice firm yet tinged with emotion, but to give you the full measure of the man whose life you've come here to honor. His story is one of sacrifice and courage, a story that deserves to be heard. Mabel Turner paused, her eyes glistening as she gathered herself to share the story that few had ever heard. The crowd stood transfixed, their collective attention glued to the woman who seemed to hold a piece of Edward Harrison's life they had never imagined. I met Edward in Birmingham, Alabama, in the summer of 1963, Mabel began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. It was a time when simply existing as a black person in the South meant living under constant threat, and yet in the heart of that storm, Edward chose to stand on the front lines. Her gaze drifted, as though she could still see the chaos and courage of those days. I was part of a group organizing sit-ins at segregated establishments. It was dangerous work. We faced threats every day, but we knew we couldn't back down. That's where I met Edward, a young teacher who had just moved to Birmingham. He was one of the few white men willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with us, knowing full well the consequences. The crowd stirred, whispers of surprise rippling through them. Edward's philanthropy and kindness were well known, but his involvement in the civil rights movement had never been part of his public story. Edward wasn't afraid to make enemies, Mabel continued, her voice firm. When his school board found out he was attending marches and sit-ins, they labeled him a troublemaker. They accused him of unbecoming conduct and fired him on the spot. He lost his job, his friends, and even his standing in the community he'd hoped to serve, but he never once regretted it. Her voice softened as she recounted the sacrifices Edward had made. He packed up what little he had and moved into a small, run-down house on the outskirts of Birmingham. I remember visiting him there. It was barely more than a shack. But Edward never complained. He worked odd jobs, tutoring kids after school and doing whatever he could to make ends meet. He told me once, I'd rather lose everything than live with myself knowing I stayed silent. Mabel's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. The mourners were silent, their faces a mix of shock and awe. But Edward didn't just stand with us. He became one of us, Mabel continued, her voice trembling with emotion. He wasn't just a friend. He became my family. When I lost my brother to the violence of those times, Edward was there. He sat with me through the long nights of grief, making sure I didn't have to face it alone. And when Edward was ostracized by his own family for standing with people like me, I was there for him. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she pressed on. We shared more than just meals and memories. We shared our fears, our hopes, and our determination to create a better world. Edward called me his sister, not out of pity or obligation, but because he truly saw me as his equal. In a time when the world tried to divide us, we chose each other. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their image of Edward Harrison evolving with each word Mabel spoke. The man they had admired for his polished demeanor and charitable deeds now appeared as someone far more complex, a man who had faced incredible sacrifices for what he believed in. Edward didn't care about recognition, Mabel said, her voice growing stronger. He didn't need applause or accolades. What mattered to him was doing what was right, even when it came at great personal cost. She glanced at the casket, her eyes softening. He carried those sacrifices with him every day, but he never spoke of them. He didn't want pity. He wanted his actions to speak for themselves. Mabel turned back to the crowd, her gaze piercing. The Edward Harrison you knew was a good man, but the Edward I knew, he was a great man. And I believe you deserve to know the full measure of who he was. Not just the philanthropist, but the fighter, the friend, and the family he chose. The crowd stood in silence, processing the revelations. The image of Edward as a quiet, generous benefactor was now overshadowed by the story of a man who had risked everything for justice. The depth of his sacrifices and the bond he had shared with Mabel painted a picture of a man whose legacy was far greater than they had ever realized. Mabel Turner took a steadying breath, the weight of what she was about to reveal evident in her pause. The mourners, already shaken by her revelations, now leaned in closer, their curiosity mixing with unease. She glanced at the casket, then back at the crowd, her expression resolute. "There's more to Edward's story," she began, her voice soft but firm. "A part of his life that none of you knew, yet one that shaped him deeply. Edward carried a secret born out of love, but shrouded in the harsh realities of the world we lived in." The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers breaking the silence as speculation rippled through them. Mabel's piercing gaze silenced the murmurs, and she pressed on. "Edward had a son," she said, her words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed through the crowd, and expressions of shock and disbelief swept over their faces. Mabel paused, letting the weight of her revelation sink in. "His name is James," she continued, her voice steady. "James is the son of Edward Harrison and a woman named Evelyn Carter. Evelyn was a black woman Edward loved deeply, but could never openly be with, not in the Birmingham of the 1960s. The world they lived in didn't allow such love to flourish without consequence, so they made the impossible choice to keep their love and their child a secret." The crowd was frozen in stunned silence, their disbelief palpable. Edward, the upstanding community figure, had carried a secret this profound? Mabel's gaze softened as she recounted the sacrifices Edward had made for his son. "Edward couldn't claim James publicly," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He feared what it would mean for Evelyn, for James, and for himself. But he never stopped being a father. He supported James in every way he could, even if it had to be done in the shadows." She reached into her purse, pulling out a bundle of worn letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These," she said, holding them up, "are just a few of the letters Edward wrote to James over the years. He couldn't be there in person as often as he wanted, but he made sure his son knew he was loved." Mabel's voice cracked slightly as she unfolded one of the letters. In one of his first letters, Edward wrote, "James, you are my greatest joy and my greatest secret. I wish the world were kinder so I could shout your name from the rooftops, but for now, Know that every decision I make is for you." Tears welled in Mabel's eyes as she looked at the crowd. He paid for James's schooling, sent money to ensure he never went without, and visited whenever he could, even if it meant sneaking into town under the cover of darkness. Edward never let the world's judgment stop him from being the father James needed. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "And today," she said, her voice steadying, "James is here." All eyes turned as a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His broad shoulders and dignified presence immediately commanded attention. As he walked, the resemblance to Edward became unmistakable. The same sharp features, the same quiet strength. "This is James Carter," Mabel said, motioning toward him with a proud smile. "Edward's son, a man born of love and sacrifice." The crowd stared, stunned into silence. James stood tall, his deep brown eyes scanning the sea of faces before settling on Mabel. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for telling the truth." James turned to the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My father loved this community. He gave his time, his resources, and his heart to make it better. But the greatest gift he gave was to me, a love that never wavered, even when he couldn't show it openly." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the mourners. He didn't want pity or applause for what he did. He wanted to make a difference, not just in my life, but in the lives of so many others. The crowd remained silent, the enormity of what they had learned settling over them. Many glanced down, ashamed that they had never seen this side of Edward. Others wiped away tears, touched by the profound sacrifices he had made. Mabel placed a hand on James's shoulder, her expression one of quiet pride. "Edward's love wasn't loud," she said, addressing the group. "It was quiet, steady, and enduring. He carried the weight of his choices every day, not because it was easy, but because it was right." James nodded, his voice firm as he added, "My father taught me that a legacy isn't about what you have. It's about what you leave in the hearts of those you love. And today, I hope you see the man he truly was." The crowd, once so stoic, now shifted visibly. Tears fell freely, and a few tentative smiles broke through as they began to grasp the depth of Edward's sacrifices and love. James's presence was a living testament to the hidden life of a man they thought they had known. The air was thick with emotion as Mabel Turner took another step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The crowd, already stunned by the revelations of Edward's hidden past, seemed to hold its collective breath, awaiting what more she had to share. "There's one more chapter to Edward's story," Mabel began, her voice soft but resolute. "A final act of generosity that I believe truly defines the man he was." The mourners exchanged glances, curiosity flickering in their tear-streaked faces. Edward's life had already been revealed as a tapestry of sacrifice and quiet heroism. But Mabel's words suggested there was still more to uncover. "2 months before Edward passed," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "he called me. His health was failing, and he knew his time was short. But instead of dwelling on what was to come, Edward focused on what he could still do. He wanted to leave behind something meaningful, something that would continue his work long after he was gone." Mabel paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "That's when he told me about the trust he was establishing, a fund dedicated to the children of this community, children whose families struggle to make ends meet, children who deserve opportunities but are too often overlooked. Edward didn't just want to help, he wanted to ensure that the help would endure." A murmur rippled through the mourners, their surprise evident. Many had benefited from Edward's generosity over the years, but few had imagined he was planning something on such a grand scale. At that moment, James stepped forward, his presence as commanding as his father's had been. "Let me tell you what my father envisioned," he said, his deep voice steady. "This trust isn't just about money. It's about creating opportunities. It will provide scholarships for kids who dream of going to college but can't afford it. It will fund after-school programs so children have a safe place to learn and grow. It will support mentorship programs to guide them toward a brighter future." James paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "My father believed in planting seeds," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. He knew he wouldn't live to see the fruits of this work, but he didn't care. What mattered to him was that the seeds would grow, that his legacy would live on in the lives of these children. The crowd was silent, their faces a mixture of awe and admiration. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the depth of Edward's selflessness. He had not only devoted his life to helping others, but had ensured that his work would continue even in his absence. Mabel's voice softened as she added, "Edward didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. What he needed was to know that he had done his part to make the world a little better." She glanced at the casket, her expression tender. "And I believe he did." James stepped closer to the casket, his hand resting gently on the polished surface. "My father always told me that a person's true wealth isn't measured by what they have, but by what they give. Standing here today, I can see that he was right. His greatest legacy isn't the plaques on the walls or the accolades in the programs, it's the lives he touched." The crowd stirred, many wiping away tears as they reflected on Edward's life. Stories of his quiet generosity began to surface. How he had paid for a neighbor's medical bills, helped a struggling family keep their home, or simply offered a kind word when it was most needed. Each story painted a picture of a man whose heart was as vast as his impact. Mabel turned back to the group, her gaze firm yet kind. "Edward taught us that true greatness doesn't come from what we accomplish for ourselves, but from what we do for others. His life was a testament to that belief, and his final gift ensures that his legacy will endure for generations." A long silence followed, the weight of Mabel's words settling over the mourners. Slowly, a sense of purpose began to replace the sorrow in their expressions. Edward's life, though marked by hidden struggles and sacrifices, had left an indelible mark on all who had known him, and on many who hadn't. As the crowd began to stir, Mabel stepped back beside James. Together, they stood as living reminders of Edward's legacy, proof that his sacrifices had not been in vain. The trust he had created was more than a gift. It was a symbol of his unwavering belief in the power of love and kindness to change the world. Mabel Turner stood quietly for a moment, letting the weight of Edward's story settle over the crowd. The faces before her were no longer marked by skepticism or confusion, but by a quiet reverence, their hearts moved by the depth of Edward's sacrifices and the magnitude of his legacy. She stepped forward, her voice steady and clear, yet carrying the warmth of a lifetime's wisdom. "Edward Harrison taught us that the true measure of a life is not found in wealth or titles, but in the lives we touch. He showed us that love and kindness are not just fleeting acts, but seeds we plant to grow something greater than ourselves." Her eyes swept over the crowd, meeting each mourner's gaze. "The question I leave you with today is this: how will you be remembered? Will your legacy be written in the things you own, or will it be etched into the hearts of those you lift up? Edward didn't need recognition or applause. He needed to know that he made a difference. And he did." The crowd stood in reflective silence, many nodding quietly, others wiping away tears. James stepped closer to Mabel, his presence a quiet affirmation of her words. Mabel turned to the crowd one last time. Let Edward's life remind us that the greatest impact we can leave is one that lives on in the lives of others. Go out and live a life that matters. The cemetery, once a place of mourning, had transformed into a place of renewed purpose.